Hello, everyone, and welcome to Below the Surface, the Halloween edition. As if you can't tell, because we don't normally dress and look like this. I'm Paul Asadorian, the principal security evangelist here at Eclipsium, joined by always my co-host, Mr. Scott Sheffy Shefferman. Scott, welcome.
Thank you. How you doing?
Doing fantastic, man. Halloween is so much fun. It's one of my favorite holidays for sure. Because you get to dress up and eat candy. Who doesn't like to dress up and eat candy, right? It's great. It's
Everybody.
great. So we've got the Below the Surface for this month that we will be discussing. I think we want to start off with some really, I'll call it scary supply chain threats. I think that's really, if we could pick a theme, that might be the theme. You started out with the really scary supply chain stuff that Department of Justice is thinking about, nation state threats. I mean, that's some of your background, Scott. So why don't we start there and talk about what was happening this month on that front?
Yeah, this whole thing with supply chain is just snowballing beyond anybody's prediction. Like if you were standing here last October during Halloween, none of us thought we'd be saying the word supply chain every other sentence when it comes to cybersecurity, for lots of reasons, right? But what's really happening here is the geopolitical landscape overall, not just with uh, politics as usual, but also just like legitimate supply chain constraints on the technology sector I mean, it's the topic everywhere you are. If you're in Russia, you're worried about your components. If you're in China, you're worried about your intellectual property and how you're going to keep up with the West. And if you're in the West, you're worried about the fact that all the gear comes from China and Taiwan, and it's influenced heavily by Chinese oversight and manipulation. And so, even just from a raw like component delivery supply chain perspective, there's a lot going on, and it's going on at the most highest levels from the executive office, like you said, the Department of Justice. Last week, I was glued to the screen watching Department of Justice talk about their indictment of Chinese folks that are Chinese intelligence folks, I should say, government intelligence folks that have been coercing and threatening and extorting people to get intellectual property to go flow back to China. And all the details were not as important as the magnitude of what's going on, and the stage has like basically formally been set. And like we talked about on the podcast last time, Paul, like the stage was even set prior to that when we did the the DHS report that took a year long to develop a 96-page report only focused on the technology supply chain and how critical it is to national security, and also how vulnerable and how compromised it is from a cyber perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is kind of coalescing at the same time. And then you have like the what is it, the FDPR rules that they came out of the late 50s, and the United States hasn't typically enforced those, but those are rules designed to protect American intellectual property, even if it's sold to one country. If that second country sells it to a third country, that FDPR can kick in. And
Mm.
so if China's selling technology that was developed here and designed here to, let's say, Iran or to China or to Russia or any other, North Korea for that matter, like these FDPR rules kick in and give the United States a legal ability to actually pursue an international law, the ability to stop those enterprises and use things like sanctions and stop money flows, and get actually tactical with how you're going to prevent an organization from giving up that intellectual property that was derived here in the United States.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's important, and it's important, I think, to make distinctions between not just nation state threats, but the supply chain, excuse me, that is very targeted versus opportunistic, right?
Yeah.
And you described even a couple of different targeted, style attacks, right? That intellectual property that may be leaked because of a supply chain attack, but that intellectual property is in the supply chain, can then have its own supply chain once it's stolen. So I think those are very impactful events typically.
And
And typically that could be a physical supply chain attack as well, which we talk about, deem as less frequently occurring, but a much higher impact because of potentially the stealth, because someone's gotten hands on potentially with the gear, right? That's what I call physical, not even potentially, but they've gotten hands on with the gear when it's on its voyage in the supply chain. And I think
Yeah.
those are scary attacks. We've seen a history of those attacks even before there were things such as computers. We saw it not so much on the supply chain side, but my one of my favorite stories in that realm is the Russians that put listening devices inside of the typewriters.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
That is a supply chain attack.
I mean, since this is a spooky episode, we're actually filming on Halloween. You bring up the physical aspect. Well, that physical or kinetic even aspect actually comes into play when you look at the UK. The news from I think it was last week. China was coercing up to 30 UK former pilots, military avionic pilots, to educate them on tactics and on maneuvers and on
Mhm.
capabilities of platforms, and paying them offering up to $250,000 just to do that. And 30 of them were coerced into doing that. There's plenty of room for conspiracy theory over whether maybe that's a counter mission where maybe a few of those pilots are actually volunteering with authorization and awareness by the UK government. That's just a conspiracy at this point. But I mean, it gets really serious. That's real money affecting former military folks. um, it doesn't get like any more serious than this, right? And you're seeing this play out not just in nation states. You're seeing the kinetic kind of threat play out to researchers doing cybersecurity on threats
Oh,
related to
yeah.
vulnerabilities in supply chain.
They were it's interesting, a supply chain, story is that I mean, this has been happening since the first exploits were ever published to the internet, and I'm using the term internet loosely because I imagine my guess is this happened when you used to dial into a BBS and go get some exploit code, and someone put a backdoor in that exploit code, hoping to get access to your computer where maybe there's some better or different exploits or security research. I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure, like,
well,
I remember that being described back in the day, and then we had, all kinds of exploit sites in the, 90s, early 2000s, and they were dangerous. It was a dangerous place to be living because it could be an exploit for you. If you didn't read through the source code, there could be a backdoor in that exploit that was targeting you. And so we still see that today. Proof of concept exploits, as you know, Scott, on GitHub, there's so many, and if
yeah.
you're not careful and you're just willy-nilly downloading and running them, which I don't recommend people do ever, you can get owned. And someone did someone do an analysis? I wanna say someone did an analysis on that, right?
Yeah, that was this month as well. Oh my God! So somebody analyzed, a set of researchers analyzed almost 50,000 GitHub repos for exploit proof of concept code. Right, like fifty
Mhm.
thousand is quite a bit. And so if you look at that code, I mean, you're sitting here thinking, oh my God, that's 50,000. So they analyzed it for all the ways that bad guys put backdoors in or callback, or they try to actually roll malware already into the proof of concept exploit code. What they found was 1 in 10, so like 4,800 or something of these GitHub repos had the malicious intent in them. And why that's interesting is because, yeah, like we already know, North Korea has been targeting like security researchers nonstop the last 3 or 4 years in like no small form. Like it's gotten really serious. A lot of researchers, some of them have actually gone kind of down low and off the grid just because of that threat. And then you have the fact that, if you're a blue team in a large enterprise and a vulnerability comes out and you need to figure out whether or not you have vulnerable devices, and you're going to go in your lab or even in production networks sometimes to use proof of exploit code to see if the device is actually exploitable. It might be vulnerable, but is it exploitable? That's something that management wants to know to make an
Mhm.
executive decision before they bring down a VPN appliance that whose uptime is paramount to the organization, right, in operations. So this proof of exploit code can end up in really crazy places in large enterprises and labs, not just on the security researchers VMware,
Yeah.
virtual
Yeah,
machine.
and hopefully not in any facet of the government, right? And in other governments. Hopefully there's a process for that, such as in our government to go, and if you're gonna go get that code, like it has to go through a review process. But you never know. I mean, we see contractors, we see people bypassing process all the time. Oh, it'll be fine just this one time until it's not, until that one time is the time when there's backdoor code in there. So we definitely have to watch ourselves in that respect and make sure we follow process and have due diligence.
Yeah,
And even though we might be rushing to get the latest exploit, so um, lots of
yeah,
exploits out there for things like VPN appliances and firewalls. I think that was the other kind of theme that I was, excuse me, that I was seeing from my perspective is that you had FortiOS from Fortinet, you had Juniper,
mm,
um, even a couple of others sprinkled in there. F5,
yep,
F5 was sprinkled in there, and a lot of them you could trace back to the favorite vulnerability if you're an attacker,
mm,
which is that unauthenticated remote command execution vulnerability or remote command injection vulnerability, depending on how you phrase it, depending on how it works. Usually it's coupled with authentication bypass to gain code execution or authentication bypass and you gain functionality of the device. The web applications that run these particular appliances tend to embody these flaws, and they always have. I mean, I can't pick on any single vendor
nope,
at any one point in time because I go back 20 years in my career, and you have an appliance that lands on your network, even like in the 90s, 2000s when I started working with such appliances, and I was like, even just like little pokes, like, wait, what do you mean you don't need a password to access that function or whatever? So this has been a constant, and I think it needs to be fixed because the stakes are much higher now, Scott, and it needs to be fixed.
yeah. So, and who knows if we'll be able to fix it? But at the very least, to your point, Paul, like we got to at least be able to know how how what devices you have, and not to get
Mhm.
into like a pitch on visibility, but like you get it, like because if you look at like some of the stuff Nate Warfield, one of our researchers here, that a lot of folks already know his name because he speaks around the world. I think he's in Argentina as we speak. He's found that when you look at like the 40OS vulnerability that came out, and you compare it to like the F5 vulnerability that was all the rage, 3-4 weeks ago, actually, sorry, earlier this spring, even way back to May. Those two vulnerabilities are both, like you said, remote code execution, but they both, the failure on the part of the developer is they're using things like headers to make trust decisions on whether or not you can access certain parts of memory on the device. And that's a really bad paradigm. It's a systemic flaw that we see across vendors. It's not any one vendor. But when you have all these advanced techniques that both bad guys and researchers alike are using these days to fuzz these interfaces, you get those chained attacks you're talking about, where you can get, user land, fuzz, find a vulnerability that gets you to some other privileged space. When you're in the privileged space, you fuzz again, you find the RCE, and now you're system level. And we've talked about this a lot on this show, but it's always worth mentioning in case we have a first time listener. Once you own one of these appliances, you can do all the things you would ever want as an attacker with any motive, any set of tactics that you want to deploy afterwards, whether it's hitting Active Directory, dropping ransomware payloads, embedding on the device, running a reverse shell off the device, and targeting an internal Windows host, like the demonstration that we put together here,
Mm.
showing how you can go from a pulse secure device, get a shell back, and then go to an internal Windows medical device and implant the UEFI all from the internet, right? Because you
Yeah.
chain these things together, and all of that circumvents the
And
majority of everybody's security stack.
it's that it's not security laziness. That's a bit harsh, right? But it's misplaced security, misplaced trust in
Mhm.
defensive devices. It's yeah, I know I have that thing in my environment. It doesn't matter where it is, but there's some network control and or firewall that prevents people from getting to it. Therefore, I feel better about security. When
Yeah.
you should feel a little better, but you should also address the systemic issues that are on that system. I think it's the same level of uncomfortableness that you should have with your endpoints in that you shouldn't say, well, I'm not going to fix that, or Microsoft's not going to fix that or issue a patch because someone has to be administrator on the endpoint. And the fact is, like, what happens if someone is administrator on the endpoint? Do you want to make their lives easy, or do
Yeah.
you want to make their lives difficult? It's the same thing if someone lands on my network. Do I want to make it easy for them, or do I want to make it difficult for them? And you have to kind of run things through threat models of what if an attacker gains control of my firewalls? What if attacker gains control of my kernel with administrative privileges? Then what? And you have to defend your network. I mean, not every other organization, some organizations may need to start with more of the basic things, which we haven't talked about on this show, but you're going to reach a point where you have to think about, and I like to think of those things exactly like that, that
Yeah.
you have to threat model that someone has, taken over certain beaches on your shorelines, and then what do you do? And
Yeah.
we saw
And
that with drivers. I mean, this is the driver problem.
yeah, well, we could talk about that too, but like just to kind of put a bow on these, the fact that all these devices are coming from the technology supply chain, the very same one that
Mhm.
is being contested at international levels, at geopolitical macro levels, in the context of, I don't want to call it World War III yet, but this massive, like, there's 80 countries now attacking each other via cyberfront based on the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and then you have the China-Taiwan thing going on, where we just sent like B-52 bombers out to that same region this morning. As of this morning, all everything's escalating, and so when things escalate, countries take bigger risks that they're not normally willing to take
Mm,
politically. They have a different political will this time, and so when you look at political will and you think about what are you trying to do at this stage of escalation, you're actually trying to actually harm. Like China's trying to pull intellectual property, but Russia's also trying to destroy, and China might try to destroy certain things too, like new chip factories we're building here, new design houses, anything to slow us down now
mhm.
that we're not copacetic trade partners like we were the last 15 years prior to this escalation. So, you have to ask yourself, a lot of these devices are made and designed here, but a lot of them are actually made and designed in Taiwan or China as well. If you look at like network attached storage devices, right? Seemingly innocent device, take one by QNAP. Like QNAP has now 12 CVEs on the CISA's known exploited vulnerability list. They added a 12th one this week, or last week, or whatever it was. And these are really bad exploits that allow you to either encrypt that device and ransom the device and the data on it that's being stored, or do worse things like tunnel through those devices to get around NSA jurisdiction here on the homeland. Like there's a lot of things that bad guys are doing with these QNAP devices and network attached storage devices. Um, Even printers are back in vogue. I mean, my first instant response was way back in the Navy in like 2000 or something. We found a printer that was beaconing home to China. Every time somebody
Mhm.
printed something, the job went to China. I think that's pretty sure that's public knowledge at this point. But what's old is new again. The only difference is that now it's on like Donkey Kong, because the vulnerabilities are coming at such a cyclic rate. The attackers are highly motivated. They're taking more risks, and the complexity of all of our enterprises and all the software running, and firmware running on these devices has gone basically parabolic. So we find ourselves at a state where I don't think very many people, there are people doing this, and hats off to them. And I know Eclipsium works heavily working with, with CISA on solving the supply chain problem. But most people aren't worried about fixing it. They're worrying about how to respond to it, how to gain visibility, how to even gauge the risk at an enterprise. Like if you have a risk register for an enterprise, right, and it's got the top 5 things that can cause the worst day for you, how often do you see firmware listed or a UEFI implant, even though those are the very threats that can cause the most damage to an operational environment, like indefinite
Yeah.
downtime, right?
No, and obviously you won't get any arguments from me, but what I think we're seeing, and it's happening slowly, and then we're just gonna wake up one day, just like we did when we said, "Well, we can attack systems over the network on the internet and just log in via Telnet or use a remote exploit." And then people started, like, it took time, but those started to go away, and we made this shift into attacking the client side.
Mm, mm,
And there were certain techniques that have evolved over time. I think this next wave that we're going to see is folks going after the real dusty, what are now dusty corners that are going to start to, we're going to start putting a light on there and start getting out our or dusters, right, and clean them out because we're going to have to, because that's where the attackers are going to push. They're going to keep pushing into firmware in different places. They're going to keep pushing into appliances, because they don't have the same protections that other modern operating systems do. But we're also seeing a shift in Windows as well.
Yeah.
Stuff that used to work before is not necessarily working right now.
Mm-mm.
Although there's exceptions to that rule still. If you go find like if you go find the first version of Meterpreter that was ever released, sometimes that actually works because we've tuned our detections over time. We basically tuned out some of the really old stuff. But like that aside, I think attackers have these new challenges that are not new, but they're kind of getting in the way. So they're finding new avenues. And that's just obviously always going to happen. It's always going to be what we call a cat and mouse game, right?
Yeah.
But I think this next evolution is things like Windows drivers,
There you go.
firmware, and appliances.
So yeah, when you look at the same KEV as the known exploited vulnerabilities of CISA, you'll find many dozens of driver level vulnerabilities
Yeah.
and
I
kernel
think you
level
said 25.
vulnerabilities,
Yeah,
right?
you said
And
25 Windows kernel and 25 driver vulnerabilities on
right,
on its the sysakev.
and the thing is, like, this research goes back over a decade, probably 13 or 14 years before like the first talk was given, probably 2011 or so. And like Richard Johnson is someone I've known for a long time. A lot of people listening
Mm,
to this might know him. He was at Talus at the time when he gave a talk on fuzzing and all the different ways to fuzz. He's kind of a fuzzing god, if you will. And when you start applying that to drivers, there's thousands of these drivers, like we always say, are trusted and signed by trusted by Microsoft because they're signed, and there so many of them are so easily vulnerable, and so many of them ironically need to interact with hardware to do the damn thing, like
yeah,
that's what they're designed to do. So
and
you
though
know
that's what I think often gets lost, Scott, about some of this driver stuff is people say, "Well, it's a vulnerable driver," and I'm like, "Not really." They're like, "Oh, well, it's a driver that they lost the signing key." I'm like, "Not really." Some of these drivers are signed, and they do what they do because they have to have that functionality, like you said, and so that's what an attacker uses to do whatever they need to do on the system,
yeah,
because the code is trusted and the code performs really low level operations. Well,
yeah.
now you've just handed it to them on a silver platter, and how do you defend against that? A lot of the
Well,
EDR space is going, oh, but we detect that stuff, and then I read another article, it's like, oh, this malware used driver escalation and they bypassed the EDR. So I'm like, which is it?
if that was true, and even Microsoft says there's ways you can configure Microsoft to prevent drivers from running. Even when we did the trick boot research,
Hmm.
I won't mention the name, but somebody at Microsoft made a tweet that said something along the lines of, "Well, all you have to do is configure Windows the right way. There's ways to catch this stuff." But the truth is, in a production environment, actually pulling that off, it's next to impossible. And
Well, and it didn't work well for a while, and you
mm-mm.
could read some of the articles that have been posted, this month online. Dan Guden did a good job of covering it as well, and Microsoft did come out and make statements that they were making improvements on it, but it was really difficult to get Windows configured properly so that it would. I think one of the things was blacklist certain drivers, which is what we're talking about, right?
Well,
Either the certificate's been lost or the key's been lost to sign the driver, or and or the driver is like malicious. Like if you found it on one of your endpoints, it would be probably suspicious for
yeah,
most of your well, like the drivers we're talking about here, Scott, like RW everything.
forget about it.
Like, yeah, like I mean, there maybe are some users, but you probably know who those folks are that would use that, right?
Or and if you're seeing any system process hit winio.sys, or I mean,
Hmm.
so if you like, North Korea makes a lot of appearances in this threat report this month, and they're abusing the crap out of drivers to great effect. I mean, they're getting everything you'd ever want. You don't need to come up some fancy way to escalate privileges on Windows when you're using a driver. Some of these drivers, like you said, even the ones like that Blackbyte are using, the ransomware group, they don't need to be. It's not a vulnerable driver. You literally just send it a command, and it executes a system.
Right.
It's working exactly like it was designed, just like you said earlier.
Hmm.
These things are just honestly, they're kicking our butt as an industry. We don't really have a good solution, but I'll tie it back to the supply chain just to say that anytime you have a device that's doing something interesting, if it has a Windows component, it needs a driver to help it do that interesting thing. whether it's a gaming mouse or whether it's a keyboard with, with processors on board. I mean, there's always a thing that needs to happen at the physical layer. And so if you think about, like, yeah, there's a vulnerable device that has its own CVE for remote code execution, but also that device might ship with a package driver for Windows. You have to look at the supply chain challenge as one that's holistic, that involves the combination of hardware and firmware and drivers. And again, all of that is like, kernel and below.
Mm,
And that's not what we're really good at as a cybersecurity industry. Our low hanging fruit that we worry about every day is usually not below the kernel, but it needs to be.
mhm, for sure. There was some other research. I did see the, Sonatype released research on 742% supply chains or attacks are up over 742% in the last 3 years alone, and, I mean, Sonatype does the so, I have to, like I'm a very visual person, so I had to, like, draw things out, which is hard to do on a podcast, but I think there's the when we say software supply chain, I think there's the software supply chain that is for developers. I'm developing code, I'm using libraries such as NPM, good lord, good luck with that, and there's dependencies upon transient dependencies, dependencies of the dependencies, and somewhere along the line, my software, oftentimes without me knowing, unless I have specific tooling to identify it, is pulling in someone else's vulnerable code, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether or not that person, the author of that vulnerable code, whether it was a bug that they put in there or whether someone took over their account or took over their persona or somehow gained access to the supply chain is yet another aspect.
That's what
Um,
happened with Python.
the
Yep.
right, but yeah, but that happens in every language and framework, and typically, I think we can kind of draw. I draw lines in the sand. Someone can correct me if they think I'm wrong. I draw lines in the sand. That's targeted at developers. That's software that you're developing. When we get down to, and I think this is a nice lead into to OpenSSL, certainly, right? When we get down to what I call almost like third party software, right? But it's not developers. So it's not a complete term. Like, it's not software I'm developing. I'm taking in someone else's software, right? This could be Firefox. It could be any application that I'm running. I'm not necessarily developing it. It's not part of my development environment, but I got to use this software. Like a driver, for example. I have to use that driver to interface with my hardware. That driver's coming with software that someone either intentionally or unintentionally made vulnerable in the supply chain. That's yet a different, I think it's a different supply chain problem because I'm not developing the software. And that these are where I draw these very high level lines. I think the next line is really firmware
Well,
where like I there is a supply chain within firmware that is even further away from my control, right? Even in my third party software, I can go, maybe I want to change that version of Firefox. Maybe I can dance around and I can compile Firefox myself and compile it with different libraries. I can use a different browser and it'll work pretty much the same if I mean, okay, there's differences in browsers, but like if I need a web browser, I can go get a web browser. It doesn't have to be Firefox. And then
right.
there's like three different ways I can install Firefox if I'm on Linux, for example. I can use Snap or Flatpak or whatever. I got options. If
So,
firmware for my system as a supply chain issue, like I'm kind of screwed in like
well,
so many different. And then it depends. Firmware is an overarching term, right? You want to talk about it in the context of UEFI. I there's oftentimes, and I've talked about it on this show in the past. Not much I can do.
well, okay. So, what I think most of us don't understand, honestly, I didn't even understand this myself until actually only a few months ago, just to be fully honest,
Hmm.
because of a coordinated disclosure effort that we're doing now that Paul, you're aware of as well.
Hmm.
That when you have the vertical supply chain for technology, let's say somebody making a laptop like a Lenovo, right?
Hmm.
Lenovo needs to give certain access to their own source code and their own firmware, even to the suppliers that are upstream of Lenovo. We think
Hmm.
of supply chain threats as flowing downstream, but they flow every
They flow back up.
direction, because when you're
Yeah.
developing, you have these trusted relationships and repositories and private keys and stuff that are going back and forth up and down the supply
Right.
chain, and it's multi-tiered and it's also complex, like laterally east to west. And like when the Intel Alder Lake UEFI source code was just
Prime
leaked, right?
example.
the
Yeah.
story there is a supply chain story. Why? Because a lot of people don't know this, or it didn't really make the news a whole lot, but it made it enough for us to catch it, which was it was a Chinese developer of Lenovo products that posted on GitHub the Alder Lake source code originally. And
Right.
that was
Mhm.
taken down as fast as the entire industry working together could possibly take it down, but not before it was replicated to other GitHubs and it's out there. Now it's out there, right? But
Mhm.
all we know is an email address associated with the GitHub account. That the email address is for a Chinese company that produces and designs products for Lenovo. And so, yeah, you can surmise what may happen, or whether it was intentional or accidental, or whether it was somebody that stole that email address, or even that developer's laptop and did this maliciously. And it has nothing to do with that. Like, don't worry about attribution here. The problem is actually one of complexity and the fact that trust needs to be extended to this massive supply chain and all the participants working in
Right.
all the physical locations, all of them with different security postures, different threat profiles themselves as individuals and
Mhm.
organizations and regions in the world. And that all comes together where one mistake leads to the source code for Alder Lake UEFI being leaked.
Right. Yeah, and it is difficult to get your brain around until you work here at Eclipsium and start thinking about it. And I look at my framework laptop, right? Like Intel makes the CPU, but inside makes the UEFI BIOS, and then Framework is the company that puts that all together. Well, there needs to be tight collaboration between those three companies. And you're right, sometimes it's back and forth, Scott.
Yeah.
But all of those players in the supply chain have to at certain points come together, and like collectively they're the only ones that can fix something when it
Yeah.
breaks. And that's just one example. I mean, think about all the other components in your laptop, PCs and servers, right? It's not just your CPU and your BIOS or UEFI and your ultimate laptop. You've got everything from your battery to your screen to your storage to your camera to everything could have that similar supply chain relationship where there's someone that provides the hardware. Someone may provide the software that has to support the hardware. Maybe there's multiple, and then there's the ultimate supplier before it gets down to you. And that's why oftentimes you don't get a BIOS update
Well,
because
let
they
me
don't
ask
want to
the
maintain
audience.
those. They don't want to maintain those relationships sometimes, which is kind of frightening, right? But the more reputable ones will. It's also why this month I thought it was exciting to see that Asus motherboards that are supporting DDR5, they're actively working on Core Boot as an alternative. And here's where I think open source is amazing because they can continue support. I've said it before that I think this is a really good thing, and here it is coming to fruition, right?
Well,
Go ahead, Scott.
yes, coming to fruition, and then it's a good thing because things can get more secure and be more flexible and have more eyes on. And yet we have the news of the week everybody listening to this will be aware of by now, which is the OpenSSL vulnerability. Open
Yeah.
source, a library. And if I ask the audience, how many of you know how many devices in your enterprise right now are running what's the vulnerable version of SSL?
Hmm.
Nobody can answer that question that's listening to this. And it's because you can't just go from what the appliance is and its model number or even its firmware version to know if the library inside that's being used is vulnerable, or even if you knew it was vulnerable, is it exploitable? Do I actually have to worry about it? Is there
Right.
an actual exploit path to get to that library that matters or not? And so we get to this
Yeah.
place
And
where the
so,
only way to understand that
but
is
in
to
that,
reverse the binary.
yeah, but in the traditional sense, when you look at vulnerability management, it's one take on the problem, right? And it takes time to catch up. So a few weeks from now, more folks that make software that includes OpenSSL is going to go, oh, that thing that I put out there that's version 2.x of my product has OpenSSL 3.0.0 through 3.0.6, I believe, are the vulnerable versions. And therefore, I need to put out an advisory, get everyone to update it, maybe issue a separate CVE. I think oftentimes they do issue like no, they is it? I don't know
They
how
they,
it
they
it
do or they don't.
depends.
So
Or they issue,
anybody
but they'll
can.
issue maybe their own security advisory more likely,
Yeah.
and go, this new security advisory, you need to update our product because we updated the version of OpenSSL. That takes time to go out, but that only gets the software suppliers that are actively looking inside their own products and producing the fix. And there are a number of them that are going to do that. There's going to be a number of open source projects that are going to come out and say, "Hey, you've got to update to the latest whatever it is because we use a vulnerable version of OpenSSL."
Okay, I'm going to bring
Hopefully
up
not. I
something
mean, hopefully
controversial.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Let's
I got to
do
bring up something
controversial.
controversial here. So we all love bug bounty programs. They have a huge value to the industry and to researchers making a living off of that. And they're absolutely necessary. There's like, even if you don't like them, you need we need them. There's no arguing that. I'll say, but
Mhm.
what's happened is so many vendors have realized that they can spend less money doing that and finding things after they've shipped code after the fact by the community, and the cadence and the regularity of vulnerabilities that are coming out makes it so that none of these organizations as developers look like they're in poor form compared to their peers, because everybody has pushed to the right instead of the left the SSDLC and SDLC, folding security into the security lifecycle, the development lifecycle. And
Mhm.
so this interesting thing is happening where, like, okay, Intel's Alder Lake source code gets leaked. And Intel's response is the only one, and it's the right one. Here's our bug bounty program that's a lot of money at stake. Go out there, go through that source code. If you find stuff, let us know. We're going to pay you ASAP. And that's the most
Mhm.
proactive thing they could do at this point in time. But then you have to ask yourself, too, like in that case or any other case out there, are there things that developers can do better to either write secure code and ship secure code? Like, if a researcher is using dynamic analysis and fuzzing to find the damn thing, the bad bug, why isn't the
Mhm.
developer spending the money to do dynamic analysis before they ship the code as part of their general security QA process? Why shift that to the
Well,
right when it goes out into the
I think
wild
they
and gets
are.
exploited first?
I
Right?
think they are, but maybe not every single time, or it does identify a bug and then it's not getting prioritized, or the pressure to ship says you're not gonna fix that bug or run
Or
that level of test, or the tools that they're running don't garner the same results as a tool someone else is running, or the tools are configured differently. So I think that's how we get, some ways in how we get vulnerable software that's inevitably always gonna ship inside of all of our products. And I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of the software vulnerability problem. It's also interesting to think when we've looked at not just the recent leak, but any leak that, and this goes back to drivers too, could involve some type of certificate or
oh,
key. And
yeah.
to me, that's right, Scott. It's a different problem. It's not a software vulnerability, but it's something you gotta go take care of if you know has one, know somehow that you're affected, and two, figure out what to do, which depending on the case, you just may not be able to do anything about it, but at least know that you have the problem. Maybe decommission that hardware, maybe decommission that software, maybe implement some kind of block list or blacklist, but all of that is gonna depend on where it is. But
Well,
my whole take on it is it's a different response than a software vulnerability. If it's a software vulnerability, I can swap it out, use different software. I can apply a patch. I can have a workaround. There's really not a great workaround if your certificate or a key or a hash or something has been compromised that basically verifies the integrity of that. I guess you could say a blanket statement, but
well,
again, it all works differently.
so my take on this, coming from, like, a few decades supporting DoD environments, right, dealing with crypto systems and cryptography, is everybody knows that works in those spaces of any sort that key management is the single hardest part of anything crypto. It's not the
Mhm,
math, it's not the users, it's the key management. And part of that I mean, keys are nothing more than secrets. We all know what happens with secrets in the form of passwords. They're already everywhere, they're already compromised. But when
mhm,
folding this back to supply chain, the organization loses control of its private keys on the daily when you talk about the technology supply chain. On the daily. Like, those private keys are found in source code. You can find them in GitHub repos, private keys. And by
mhm,
definition, the second you have a private key that you no longer have security control of, that's not stored offline, that doesn't have audit involved around key management, your crypto system is fundamentally broken and you're giving yourself lip service. Same thing with revocation. It's the hardest thing to do. Like, Microsoft will say it's the hardest thing they can ever do. is actually build a system that would allow them to revoke signed certificates that they signed and trusted that they want to revoke. It's physically hard. It's a complexity physics problem to actually go out there across the internet and the globe and revoke certificates. So you can't really, like, you could
Mhm.
say, Microsoft, you got to do a better job. Microsoft's going to say, show me how, and I will do it, because it is the hardest thing to do. Just be honest, right? So,
But I think
I
that's
mean,
that's completing the loop and completing the system is having the capability to react when something needs to be revoked and
absolutely.
replaced with something else. I mean, there are many crypto systems that have to operate on that particular principle, and I think it's harder in some areas than it is in others, but it is a fundamental principle. Like, that's the whole reason it's there in some cases,
Mm,
is to go, "Oh, something doesn't check out, I need to stop." Or something's been compromised, I need to then reissue a certificate, right?
it-
And reissue the signing and redo the signing process so that in the future people know that whatever this was in the past is bad, right? I mean, we see concepts in secure boot of just that. When there's a vulnerability in a bootloader, we update the revocation list so that everyone knows we're booting. We don't trust that software. And you can say that that's some people poke at that and say it's broken. I think it actually works pretty good right now compared to, oh, let's say Windows drivers, for example, where the revocation has I don't know, more widespread. I mean, it's
it doesn't even
not
work.
even
They
as
can't even do it.
disastrous, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in secure boot, yeah, my system's not gonna boot. Likely, I can go in and I can remediate that problem, although there's issues where you might not be able to. That aside, when you do it with driver, let's say you mentioned a graphics driver. Let's say your graphics driver is on the revocation list and gets the signing certificate for that gets revoked, and Windows doesn't load it. Now, I'd like to say that you're not gonna have a display, but likely in Windows case, you're gonna go from, like, this fabulous resolution, this 1440p, like, back down to old school 800 by 600 because it's gonna load that base driver, right?
Right.
And it's gonna go, "I can't load your NVIDIA driver because you told me not to. It's not trusted anymore."
Yeah.
So
It's
that's I think why drivers are a particular problem because it is your interface to hardware. If you revoke a driver, that hardware is not gonna work and
yeah.
your manufacturing is gonna stop. Your users are gonna be somewhere traveling and their laptop's not gonna work. So that's why
Yeah,
I
we
think.
have an operating system that the majority of the world uses that A can't revoke signed certificates that are trusted, and B can't enforce, it doesn't even claim to try to enforce the boundary between user level and system, or admin and system level privileges. I mean, if you put those two statements together and you ask yourself, like, do you remember back, like, whatever, 15, 20 years ago, when we were all like, how are we going to build a trusted operating system? Like, how would you do that? What would that look like? And lots of those have been built. They're not very usable, though. They're not very flexible. They can't
Right,
serve
right.
8 billion people. So it's
Well, and the other problem, Scott, with Windows is you've gotta support lots of different hardware devices
yes.
that all have device drivers, right?
Yeah.
Apple's got a slightly different take on this issue, and we have a slightly, I think, different kind of risk profile, if you will, for Apple. We're very trusting of Apple, but they've got a much greatly reduced supply chain to be able to secure. But they're somewhat not as transparent, right?
Yeah.
So the risk for leak is less because they, like Intel, has to work with all these different OEMs and manufacturers, so they use Intel chips. Apple's like, well, I got my own M1, M2 design, and I'm the only one that's gonna use it. So they don't even have to share out as much information with as many people as Intel and Microsoft who want to run on everything. So there are trade-offs here, right? The trade-off with Apple is we don't get as much visibility, right? Although one of the things we saw this month was they stood up, I think it's security.apple.com, and wrote an amazing article about memory management.
It was
I'm like, well,
amazing. Yeah.
right, and that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it was super well written. And Apple struggled this last year. I think there's, I don't know how many. I don't want to guess, but somewhere between 8 and 12 pretty bad iOS, Mac OS. They share the same kernel, like, updates that have happened, and for,
Well,
like,
yeah,
really critical exploited in the wild vulnerabilities. So bad things are
sure.
happening in the Apple
Everyone
space.
suffers from memory management. I mean, the Google Chrome team does an amazing job, and even at the amazing job they do in implementing specific methods to for different types of memory corruption.
Yeah.
They still have memory corruption vulnerabilities, right? Everyone does, but I think but taking the problem head on, much like Google does. Google had a great study about how they're, I think it was, into, well, use after free
Oh, yeah.
vulnerabilities, and they wrote a great paper, about how they're dealing with use after free vulnerabilities. It was very similar to Apple's paper they just published about how they're dealing with memory corruption, memory management issues. And I think by putting it out there in the open, getting people talking about it, sharing their techniques is a really a positive thing.
It's part of building trust, and I think Apple
Mhm.
realizes that if they're gonna stake their flag on privacy and trust, then they have to be more transparent with how they're accomplishing that.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what you're seeing with that new blog, which I agree, by the way, was so well written. I learned a ton just reading it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
It's good stuff.
yeah.
Anything else you wanna talk about, for this month's Halloween edition?
Man, the let's put a cap on it. When it comes to supply chain threats, right? When you have threats from the supply chain, you have threats to the supply chain. You have both bad actors and also innocent actors of developers, etc., that are targeted themselves or their machines are compromised. And all of that complexity adds up to one thing for the attacker: a massive opportunity to do things the easiest way with the least amount of lift, to target the most number of devices and evade the rest of the security stack that we've been relying on in the endpoint space, Paul, like you spoke about, better than they've ever been able to before. An attacker has never had more advantage than they have today, despite 4 or 5 years of strong EDR, AI, machine learning, XDR, all the data lake stuff we're doing to understand data on a large side, all the network security we've been trying to layer on and figure out, all the updates to kernels, UEFI itself is an up, like all of these have brought us to this moment. And yet we're still having this super spooky episode where we're talking about the fact that on any given Sunday you could escalate privileges on Windows or use a driver to accomplish kernel level tasks, or embed at the UEFI level, or ship malicious code out of 48,000. I mean, of uh, as a researcher, like you have 48,000 proof of concept exploits. 1 in 10 of those is actually maliciously modified as you're
Mm.
looking at it. Like it goes on and on. And I feel like the attacker advantage has never been stronger. And enterprises have never been more blind and blindsided by this evolution of the threat landscape that is shifting to the supply chain.
Well said, Scott. Everyone be safe out there. Have a happy Halloween. We'll see you next time.
Good stuff.